All right. Welcome everyone at the next multi-networking community sync. Today is June 21st. We have quite a good agenda for today. Doc, you want to go first?
Yeah, thanks, Mache. Yeah, I just wanted to bring up that I feel like sometimes we're getting kind of stuck slash in a log jam here and again with people bringing up like the cases that are important to them, and we'll have a situation where it'll be like one person will be like, well, that's important to me, another person will be like, that doesn't fit my scenario. And I on either end of those discussions, I think that that stuff is important, but what I feel like is we're not necessarily capturing those kind of conversations, because I think that we can get good output from the results of getting people on the same page. So I wanted to kind of bring up like the idea of maybe forming some kind of strategy so that we can maybe both capture more of that discussion, but also give us a way to maybe like potentially park those conversations and allow people to work on them asynchronously. Like maybe have some kind of a thing like where we can be like, hey, okay, we've identified like we've been on this problem for, let's say, 7 minutes, and we're stuck. Like, could we say like, okay, hey, this merits more discussion, and maybe we could have people write it down and then have them put in the kind of data or evidence that backs their position. And then maybe we could cycle back through this kind of stuff on a regular basis. And kind of what I'm thinking is it might give us a way to kind of get ourselves unstuck, and also have a way to see if we can get some value out of like completing those conversations.
Yeah, I hear you. I think that's fair. Like, not because right now, what at least I'm trying, because I'm driving most of the time, trying to get those results on the meeting, right? And then I'm waiting for the next one, and that takes time. I agree with you. That's a fair point too. If we have some contention around anything, just shelf it. Have some documentation set, do it offline, and then if any additional um, doubts, then touch it on the meeting. Is that what I'm hearing, Doc? Because that's something that we think of.
Yeah, that's yeah, I think that captures the gist of yeah, the gist of what I'm bringing up.
So that we then can cycle through things, through more cycle through more things. That's, I think, what you're getting at, right? So try to capture topics and have more kind of topics that we touch on that this meeting, rather than drill down into every particular one thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we could even do it as simply, or maybe for smaller items, what we can do is put a section on the agenda that's like
Yeah.
a parking lot or whatever you want to call it, and then let people comment on it there, and then maybe we can cycle back to those in
Yeah.
further
We can
calls.
we can start creating action items, or I don't know, action requests, or whatever you want. Every company has their own names for that, but basically items that someone has to kind of work on for the next meeting, to kind of, yeah, that kind of things. That's what you have in mind.
Yeah, exactly. You got it.
Yep.
Yeah. And I think that's a good way to phrase it too, is like, yeah, assign the actions, and or whatever we want to call them, and then yeah, let people go off and do that. And then also I think it'll be good because it'll it's it's just human nature that there are going to be some people that are better thinking about them in their quiet space, and there's going to be other times when people are have a loud voice about stuff, and then we can we can cover kind of everybody's approach too.
The thing here is I would try to keep myself in check as well, but I would welcome other folks participate and catch me or any of the discussions in such a state, right? So we don't bog down ourselves and maybe provide the stopgap kind of during the discussion and kind of to take a step back and do this, right? Create this action item from a specific topic so that we can continue on something else. So
Totally, and I absolutely agree. It'll only work if we all try to identify when this is happening.
yeah, exactly. So I ask everyone to kind of participate and then maybe say that, right? That if something is being prolonged and being kind of bogged down, let's please call it out, everyone, and then we can shelve it, and then let's discuss next week and let go move on. So please let's do that, and I encourage everyone to kind of participate and catch those as well. I will try to do it myself as well, be more rigorous, but if I'm sometimes kind of get myself bogged down and
It's well, everybody does it, and everybody has maybe like different ideas of like what the priorities are. So maybe
right.
yeah, we can help sort those out too.
Yeah. All right, Doug, anything else on this topic?
No, that's great, awesome, and thanks for adding the section. That's great.
All right. I have another bullet. I added you, Tomo, as the owner, but I added that one. This was from the 2 weeks before a meeting. The recording was finally there, so I was managed to look at it. So there was discussion. You brought up a topic of can we have multiple items in the params reference of the pod network. I think that was something that you brought up. I think because you wished to kind of reference like not only the custom stuff, like for example, you would reference network attachment definition and you would reference a resource claim or something like that, right? One of the examples. I think it's a matter of do we want it, because from the implementation point of view, it doesn't matter really, because core, at least from the core point, the core will never parse those elements, right? It will only look at whether those exist or not. That's the only thing that the core will do. And then it is up to the implementation on how this is going to be handled. That's what it basically is. The only concern I would have just kind of come to my mind is the conditions that I was kind of trying to build behind this. Let me maybe show what I have in mind on that. Share this tab. What I mean by conditions. So right now, I have in mind of having those guys here. So we have 3 conditions, but basically what we have is the params ready. And if you look at the example of the description of the params ready, is it should be populated by the implementation if the params ready field is anything other than nil, right? So basically, if I set anything here, the core is going to expect that someone sets this field, right? Someone sets, sorry, not field. Someone sets this condition params ready in the network object. And this is kind of boils down how conditions work. I'm not sure folks how folks are familiar with the conditions themselves, but think the conditions that we have on a pod, right? When pod starts up, there is I think phase condition basically. There is always a ready condition. And what happens is there is a centralized controller for the ready conditions, but then there are other conditions for the other elements, right? Done by some other components, like kubelet, mostly by kubelet, right? And basically what happens is those controllers synchronize between each other through those conditions, right? The ready will be ready when all the other conditions values are correct, right? So basically, if the pod containers didn't came up ready because kubelet or CRI didn't came back and say, okay, I started all the conditions, then the main ready conditions will never get set ready because the previous one are not there yet. Okay, so you can build some sort of dependency between the conditions with that, right? Each controller owning specific condition and specifying and providing values, and then you can create some sort of dependency. Okay, I will never make ready until the other guys are not there. So this is something that I'm trying to do here. And if we were to have a list of those parameters, right, your implementation would have to support that list. So maybe that should be fine, right? If you were to have a list, right, your implementation has to now look through all the parameters and then check whether they are okay to say that the whole thing is ready, because you have only one conditions for that field, right, and for the readiness of the parameters. So this is where the complication goes, because this can be one of the approaches where I can have one controller handling all the parameters in the list. But what if that's not the case, right? Because in what if the each parameters is completely from different stuff, right? And there is separate controllers for each of the parameters. That's kind of would complicate things, or can lead to a complication if we were to make this field a list. I'm not sure did I explain this correctly? Hopefully I did. So that would be my argument to just keep it as is to single field, because then we know I have one controller for this field and for this condition that says that looks at the origin, the parameters object, validates it, do whatever it needs with it, and then reports to the network object, oh, okay, my reference, this reference object in this network is all good, right? And then sets this parameters ready field, and then the whole object can become ready and used. You go ahead, Tom.
So so you're talking about the implementation size, the implementation, right?
I'm talking about the.
I mean, and then also your explanation have the you assume that this part, if the Params ref is array, at that time the multiple element is manipulated by each controller. I mean that the one controller manages the one object only, and then hence the controller is two or more. But I'm also thinking that the one provider, of course, the provider is one string. I do not changing this stuff. So the one provider have the one controller which managing the multiple parameters. So this is also the valid design, I think. So maybe your design you talked about, I mean that the parameters managing the first element is managed by controller A, second is managed by the controller B. At that time, maybe the pod network status, if the bounds is decided, someone needs to be consolidate the controller A result and the controller B result. But this is purely about the implementation dependency. This is not the core, and then this should be delegated to the implementation side.
That's true, but how would you distinguish A and B? Is that up to the implementation? What you're saying? So that's because you were saying that basically A and B would report between each other, and there will have to be some.
No. I'm just thinking the one controller managing the both Params ref. I mean that the one network object having the Params ref, and then the multiple. I mean that okay, let's Params ref have the object A and object B and object C, and then these three objects is managed one controller by the provider field of the network.
Patrick, you have a hand.
Yeah, I want to point out one thing here. The conditions as they are specified make sense, I just want to point out that they are not actually reliable. So even if parameters were ready at some point, when some controller checked the condition and set and updated the status, it might be that sometime later the user accidentally deletes the parameters. And that means that the condition can go back to not being satisfied.
And there is that, Patrick, and this is to what I think you asked one of the comments on.
Yeah.
What if someone deletes that object, right? And this is what I was trying to tell you in the comments. It's up to the implementation whether they allow that or not, right?
The implementation can't prevent it.
It can in some ways. I know that there is always because there is at least finalizers that can prevent you from deleting an object. So basically, you can create a finalizer, put a finalizer on an object. Of course, finalizer can be deleted by a user. Then the other ways is you can create a webhook that will prevent complete deletion if some condition is met. Then you can delete the webhooks, but at that point we're talking about like kind of hacking, right? And yes, of course, when you hack, you can eventually get yourself to a broken state. And that's okay. Someone hacked you. Someone kind of not hacked you. Someone just on purpose, just trying to break stuff. But in normal usability, that would work, right? And
okay, let's talk about the others, about the in-use thing. How do you use? What I'm missing here is some indication of what someone is supposed to use to do with these conditions.
Okay, so those conditions are for those conditions are for the rest of the implementation. So basically, if a pod network is not ready, it will never be used by a kubelet. It will see, oh, this object is unused, is not ready. You reference an unready network, pod network, and basically I cannot create this pod. That's
so
what
if the implementation sets for condition and checks for condition, why define these particular conditions at all?
No, no, wait. Because at one point, you're saying that
if a user never needs to look at these conditions, never needs to write some code, if there's no common controller that needs to act on these, it doesn't need to be in the cap. You might need the conditions field, but you don't need these particular conditions.
So those would be twofold, right? It will be definitely, I think we're trying going over to the main topic, but those would be twofold. First, debuggability, right? And the other thing will be kind of a signal for your implementation. It's what you're saying is your implementation has to use it, but then if we don't have it here, what is the other way to kind of to define that, right? I agree with you. If your implementation doesn't respect those, then they are meaningless. But then otherwise, how would I do that, right? There is no other thing that I can do this, right? And I can have, this is very simple controller that I can have in core that will check whether you set the params or not, and whether you set the params ready condition, and then I will set the ready for you. And then if there is any pod using this network because it was ready, and anyone using pod is referencing this network, I will set the in-use condition. So basically, those are debuggability information, right? Metrics, even you might say. So whether you're gonna use them or not, that's kind of up to implementation. I agree with you. But for example, the in-use is very useful, right? Because this can be very well handled by the core, by the controller in the core, which will see, okay, someone reference this pod network in a pod, so I will mark it as in-use. And basically, I agree with you. If you want to do anything else with it, then do or not. But at least the in-use is very useful, because I see then, okay, there is some pod in my cluster that's using this pod network. And then there is some dependency on this one, because then you cannot delete that pod. And since I'm in core, there is no workaround for this one. So the in-use is very useful. The ready, I agree with you. This is up to the implementation whether they will respect it or not. right? But still, it gives this is a very cheap way to do and gives you a lot, right? And whether you use it or not, then that's another thing. So I don't think what you said that it's not really it's not going to be used by the core, so we shouldn't have it. I don't agree with you on that one because it's for at least debuggability is very useful. That's at least my, and of course it boils down to how you do your implementation, but I want to open up the kind of ability to do this, right? That's what. If you won't leverage that, then that's your implementation. Then you're gonna maybe miss out on something on debuggability items that your implementation could have. And if you long-term kind of wish to really support multi-networking, you definitely will want to have that for your own sake, right? If you want to support something like that. Did I think Patrick, you first, did I answer your kind of
well, it's a bit, it seems a bit subjective whether this is important enough, but I'll just take it at face value. And if you say that it's important, then I guess it is. I don't have any particular stake in this. I'm not implementing a provider myself. I'm just looking at it from a CAP and API perspective, and I wonder, what is it good for? Is it called out in the documentation how it's supposed to use? What is the must for a provider, for example? Is that an optional feature? Is it must be provided? Set those. These are here, yeah.
Okay. Michael,
I lost track of the conversation a little bit. Can I get like just a 10-second summary? Because it sounded like we were asking about, is the conditions useful or required here, or was it something related to the provider? Sorry.
So initially we started discussion on the parameters and making this a list, right? And I'm trying to explain what is the consequence of the list. It is slightly connected to the conditions. That's what it boils down to. And then the discussion whether those conditions are even useful. I am saying they are, because they are great. Most of this will be implemented, like all of this will be implemented by condition, except for the params ready, which responsibility falls on the implementation of the referenced parameters ref, right? So basically, if this field is empty, nobody is going to expect this guy. But if someone provides this field in the pod network object, then the automation will expect the params ready condition to be set. And then that responsibility falls on the controller. And this is in the text as well, yes. And now boiling down to whether this can be a list or just a single element. I think a list, this is just Tomo. I think if we were to have a list, to be honest, I don't have a strong feeling about this. Anyone else has some opinion on this? Whether should we make this a list? What I'm thinking here is this as well, since I'm referencing an object, right? And the list will just allow you to reference multiple of those, but then you could same way reference the additional object in your own reference, right? So to make a kind of a chain, but maybe not. Maybe we should have a list here. But then this complicates on this params ref ready condition, because then you would have to have a centralized element that understands all of the objects in the refs, right? And then can summarize everything together, and then finally set the condition as one thing. That will be the kind of the hurdle if we had this a list.
Okay, so it's either a single parameters ref or some sort of slice of, And is this one of these conditions where I need to just write it down and kind of discuss the use cases?
I think so. That's a fair point. Yeah. Let's make me do that. Thanks, Michael, for bringing that. Let's make me. Tomo, can I ask you to do that?
I think someone's capturing it as an action item. Oh, thank you.
I am.
One general thing on this kind of stuff, it feels to me like if it were a list, would there be an impact on people who only need a list of length 1? And there may be some people who do have a use case that care about it. So my instinct would be, if there is a use case, if we come up with one, we should probably be fairly permissive about it. I'm quite relaxed, but let's leave it till we've got the right.
So So yeah, I'm okay at writing down. But the one example is about the one network pod network object may be shared with the multiple net attached def case. I mean that let's imagine that the one network, okay, from the network topology side, one network is connected by SLB interface and MAC VLAN interface. Then, and of course, and then also this network want to using the default. The IPAM is managed by the Kubernetes, not external. And then the user is thinking that they want to launching the two kinds of the pod, roughly. One pod is important pod. This requires the high-speed network bandwidth or some stuff. At that time they'd like to attaching the SLB interface this network. And then another kind of the pod is the cheap kind of pod. At that time, of course this is important to the customer use case, but they'd like to having the MAC VLAN interface because that this is not care about the high-speed network. At that time, the one network, I mean this due to by the pod network design, one pod network manages the one IPAM in case of the Kubernetes. So the two pod network can touch in with the one Kubernetes IPAM, right? So I'm assuming that the one pod network is care about the one IPAM solutions. So in this case, of course, you don't want to attaching the two or more. The net attached def is the which mentions that which is in the same network.
Yeah, definitely.
And then maybe that somehow we should add in the provide way to which type of interface they want to choose in the pod network attachment is about maybe the pod attachment selection. I forgot that the name, but yeah.
So no, I definitely don't want to go for that. The only definitely that I would be against to make ability to select kind of one of this. This pod network represents one connection to a pod. If we make this a list, it will be only for you to provide additional parameters for that single network, not to provide multiple
additional network. Which is the additional network? So the MAC VLAN and SLB, the both configuration is just the same. They just appear, right?
No, those are two separate networks. Those are two separate pod network objects at that point.
So, but also so this means the IPAM cannot be used, is shared by the Kubernetes.
I think at that point, probably not. If you were to use the Kubernetes IPAM, and you want to share, because what you're trying to achieve is shared a CIDR or a subnet between two networks that you defined. And if you want to do that, do your IPAM on your own, not through Kubernetes, because Kubernetes would assume, yes, separate subnets per pod network. But if you want to share them, you can do it same way today you do it today, right? You have whereabouts or a static or one of those. So let's assume whereabouts. You can define the same range subnet, but then different ranges in that subnet for each of your network attachment definitions. That's how you do it today anyway. So, and that's what you would do it here and then reference them in pod network. It's not like you can have what you just described with one network attachment definition. You have to have two separate anyways. That will, I mean, IPAM define those things for you. Yes, Kubernetes here uses whatever the default IPAM can do. If you want to do something what you're describing, then you would have to, that's not the topic we are not talking about, because now what you're saying is that can be completely a separate cap where you would want to change how the IPAM is done in Kubernetes, where, okay, I want to support a case what you just described, where I can share a single subnet across multiple pod networks. And this is something that can be an extension in the future to what we are creating here. So right now I'm trying to just make a conformance to what's currently available in Kubernetes. I don't want to expand the current IPAM as it is, because that's a separate topic. I consider that as a separate topic. Can you agree with me, Tom, on this?
So this means the pod network is not about the network. This is
No,
not.
it is about
This
the
is pretty
network.
about. So even though the one network sharing the two implementation, we should have the two network, right? One network represent the two network, or four network, 5, 6. So customer is getting confused, right? Because
I'm
they
not,
are
I'm
is
not
want to
following.
someone. I mean that. Okay, let's imagine the customer may want to do these stuff, as usual. Mac VLAN, SLB, like the Intel, the NIC, Mellanox NIC, or some of
Okay,
the
yeah,
stuff. At that
sure,
time,
okay.
they may have the one network is consist by the various net attached def, because each devices requires the different parameters. So even
Okay,
though
yeah, but don't you do that today anyway?
Mhm.
You do that today, don't you?
Motors can
Shit.
do that.
Right,
Yeah.
that's what I'm saying.
So
So
and then
I'm-
at that time, the net in Motors case, net attached def is not the network object. So the customer is likely to thinking the one network have their multiple net attached definition, and they're attaching to the stuff they want to. But so we are going to introduce their network object, right? So this
okay.
is not the net attached definition or network attachment. We called this is the
But
network.
from your point of view, it will be the same, right? From your point of view, from Multus's, not yours, sorry, from the Multus project's point of view, it will be synonymous. At least it should be. That's how I would at least envision this.
So you mean that the pod network is just the net attached there, right?
Yes.
But so from I'm just talking about the let's imagine some newbie is joined, is looking in the mouse network cap.
Mm-hmm.
At that time, this kind, so then this newbie is reading the pod network, right?
Mhm.
At that time, that this user must understanding this is the network object, because the pod network it seems to be
Okay.
the pod network.
Okay.
So this means the user is thinking about this is kind of the if someone is good at the OpenStack neutral, right?
Mm-hmm.
At that time, this is pretty one network, and then one network is just the computer network. I mean that which creating.
I know what you say. You're trying to bring
various
just-
media is connected.
So
At that time, they may thinking the one pod network can attaching by the several way, SRB, Mac VLAN, or some stuff.
that's
but
fine,
the-
Tomo. But
in your use case,
let me
we
cut
need-
in a bit
Okay.
here. Just to let you know how a network is represented, because you're trying to get and push one model of how a network is viewed. Yes, that user that you described views the network as such, but that boils down to how the network is visible by the implementation, not by this. This just is an API, a common API across the board, so that you don't have to use annotations and then have the integration with core. That's the core. That's the main concept of this. And this represents a network. And you're trying to say now, oh, it represents network, so it has to mean that. No, we said that's why we don't call it a network. We call it a pod network, because pod network is just a handle to whatever you have in mind what a network means for you. So please don't make it in a stable like definition, one definition of it, because we almost explicitly called it pod network because it's just a representation of a network that your implementation think it is. If your network thinks a network means just a slice of a subnet, that's what it is. If you want to make a pod network a whole subnet, it can be that if your implementation supports that. So it's up to implementation on what represents a network. Okay.
Okay, let me sharing that my concern is if let's imagine the one network is connected to SRB and then the Mac VLAN, and then as you mentioned, the user is creating the two pod network object, and then in the future, of course, they want to configure the network policy and service. At that time, currently I'm thinking for each pod network, the network policy and the service is created. At that time, the two pod network may creating the different network policy, right? And how we associate, how core understanding which network and which network is sharing the endpoint.
We have a hands. I think, Michael, you were first.
Yeah, I was just citing back to what I just said about 5 minutes ago about writing this one down.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I think this is some slightly other concern. I'm not sure it's related, Tomo, right? To this being a list versus what you're right now referencing to. If it is, then let's shelve this and let's write it down and get back to it next week.
Okay.
Jaime? Oh, no.
Yeah, so sorry. Probably a different view of what Tomo is saying. In this whole spec with this whole API, we have on the pod spec, we have pod networks, and then we have attachments references, or a separate field for attachments. I think that a different view of what Tomo is saying, or I might be wrong, but something that, or how you interpret it, is that when we are specifying the pod networks, we have these parameters ref that allows implementations to add their own parameters to that network, right? And then the spec has also some parameters for the pod network attachment, pod network name, interface name. So this spec is recognizing the data model that an attachment is intrinsically different than a network. So one thing is a network and another thing is how a pod attaches to that network. But what I'm missing here is the extensibility to allow implementations to add their own parameters in this pod network attachment.
And thank you, Jaime. This is what I think last week. So let's make it to a next. I think this is the last bullet. Before we go to the last bullet, Jaime, we will get back to that because this is what we ended our discussion last week with Michael about the CNIs. Let's get back to that. But before we do that, I have one more bullet item on the agenda. So the params ref, Tomo, please write down the network stuff so we can back to that next week. Now I had some bunch of comments in the initial CAP PR, which I think I addressed most of them. So the requirements, the story slightly evolved. So I would ask everyone here who has any stake in the initial stories and the requirements to go through them again, because they might have slightly diverged to what we initially kind of come up in like January. That was kind of half a year ago. Right now, as I mentioned last week, the CAP, what we are making is we create this one CAP and we're gonna keep iterating on it. With what we're doing today, that's what's gonna happen. So please give the CAP another read if you want to. There is a lot of comments, so you can open it in my branch and just go browse to that file, and you will have a clean file with all the markdown scene, so you can read that and then comment on the PR itself. So I recommend going through that again if anyone, some of you didn't look at it for some time. Because I'm trying to push the leadership to finally get LGTMs on this and finally merge it because it's just taking so long. Okay, now getting back to the reference. So last week we, I think, finalized on the discussion of the kind of how things can be done in terms of like CNIs, because I think the initial discussion was, what does this primary really means, right? Here, because that's what we kind of bog down on 6 versus 4, and then how can that be done and managed? I think, Michael, we are on the same page now on what I was saying. I think we had the kind of heated discussion last week on how the CNI, how much can it be involved or not. I think you're now on the same page. What is the other option, like through the agents and then all that? Michael Cambria.
No, I'm not sure yet. I have to. If I can, no. two things. If I can do everything I want as I described it, where we simply point to the CNI plugin, conf list, which gives me the plugin, then I'm happy. My other concern is the minute people start seeing all this other stuff, they're going to think they have to use it despite the word optional.
Fair point. Yes. I'm not sure what to say on that one, right? Because the same thing goes like if in our pod network we have this IPAM stuff, right, as well, right? And it boils down to similar case in point, right? Similar thing, but I think that's the nature of the APIs, or that's why we are discussing it, right? Whether they are useful or not.
Let's tie this back a bit to the prior conversation quickly. We can. Once you have what's called a dual home network, I don't care if it's Kubernetes, doesn't make a difference. You have two interfaces. The IETF compliant implementations can use both of them concurrently. You can send packets on one, receive replies on the other, etc., etc. IP address functionally is on loopback, whether you put it on the interface or in the IPAM for a given net attached, whatever you want to call it. In Linux and every implementation I know of, you can reach that regardless of what interface, what wire you're using, and any definition contrary to that is just confusing users.
But then you have things like IP spoofing, right? Source address validation. That's outside of the pod, for example. And then that matters, right? Because
but are we trying to solve that in this cap?
No, no, not
making sure.
We know, no, we are not. But I'm drawing an example.
No, I agree, and I'll argue now. If you're on a cloud, you can set things up such that the cloud will enforce that it's bidirectional, even though IP doesn't force you to the cloud.
Right.
That's fine. If your implementation, if you pick a VPC on AWS, for example, you'll get that bobbing changes in the last 6 months. That's fine. But we don't need to do anything here then. The same with, there are implementations on bare metal. The network that you pick, the CNI conf list that you select has already mitigated all that. You don't have to here. And if they didn't, then that's a different issue anyway.
Okay, but then how do we address the other use cases? This is what you're saying, or your use case, but then we want to kind of apply to like the other use cases that don't only kind of boil down to just the conf lists, right? So I think somewhere I think somewhere in the text, I will have to read it again. I think I have somewhere that one of those elements has to have a primary field set. And this is something that I need to remove for your use case, right? To say that, okay, I don't have to set it, right? I'm not sure whether you can use in conflicts the interface name field at all at that point, if it's a CNI, because, okay, can you take that as an argument?
Oh, yeah. In fact, it's required for CNI. You have to specify the network namespace in Linux, which is implied here. Because pods already do it. And if you don't specify the interface name, you get 0 by default. So on the second attachment,
so this is
you have Altus calls them net 1, net 2, etc.
Sure. Okay, so basically what you're saying, interface name is useful in your use case, in the CNI use case. Okay, but the primary is something that you're not seeing.
Primary is something that today already in the existing implementation is in the conf list. 1, 2, you're essentially suggesting which one should have the default route.
I am, yes.
Because at the end of the day, if there's multiple interfaces and you match a different one with the packet, you won't use it. I don't need primary, essentially. Well, you're looking for the one that's going to use the default route instead of putting it in the CNI configuration.
Yeah, hard coding it. Yes, in the yeah. So
well, right, but except let's go back to the last week's argument that nothing's hard coded because in V6 there is no such thing as default route. It has to come from the route advertisement.
And this is where, okay, because that's where it started. I agree with you. Depending on how you're doing V6, right? If you're doing route advertisement,
if you're doing an IETF compliant, everyone in the world knows what you're talking about. Yes, if you're doing something that's sort of like IPv6 Lite, and you're gonna specify things your own way, then we may need to, then I agree, we'll need to specify things your own way, but don't say it's compliant.
Yeah, okay, not compliant to V6, but then that's a kind of sin of today's Kubernetes, right? If I'm not
Right, and
mistaken,
so
because
right, and so I'll bring up the house of cards again, right?
right, because that's where that's what it is today, and I don't want to touch on this today because that's a separate cap we need to then touch on in the core rather than
I'm just reminding you of what my last week's comments were.
Yeah. But I think we are on the same page. And what I want to touch on all this from all this discussion is, and I think we have Michael here, Michael Zappa. You can tell me, can I say that? Can I say that the CNI, what Michael Cambria is saying, that support for having the name taken as conflict and basically having provider some support, can I say that is one of the implementations?
Well, I'm one of the CNI maintainers, but so is Mike Cambria. And actually, Mike Cambria is one of the originals, so I'll let him answer that one.
Can I say that CNI supporting multi-networking, it's basically one of the implementations?
Yeah, and I strongly suggest anyone that needs to convince themselves of this to use Podman or Docker. Docker doesn't use CNI under the covers, but it's the same look and feel. I can with Podman do everything I've ever asked for this KEP to do, and have been able to do it for months, years actually.
Mm-hmm. So,
and then some, because I'm able to specify the arguments that Doug and Tomo want. I could literally set up multiple networks, each with their own static IP, and that IP would be addressable on any interface, regardless of which one the Podman network attached was done on.
okay, so I think
I'm answering yes.
Okay, so in that case, why I'm trying to say that? I'm trying to say that because I would not want to how CNI is going to be handled be a subject of this KEP. That's what I'm boiling down to.
Right, but you're trying to make this KEP do all the stuff CNI already does.
And that's perfectly fine then, right? Isn't it?
And I'd rather keep all of the network out of the API server. I just want to know which network I have to put in the pod.
Exactly. Okay, so what you're saying, so this is you saying to what Jaime, so kind of in contradiction to what Jaime was saying, right? Jaime wants to have even more configuration on this level. You say you want less.
Well,
am I hearing that right?
I won't speak for Jaime, but you're never gonna. This is the issue. You're never gonna get everything that will be needed where the CNI implementation will. So essentially, you're trying to bless. The KEP's trying to bless certain network implementations by making them first-class citizens, and the rest of us are going to be.
No, let's make sure
from a marketing standpoint, because I drink with a lot of marketing guys, they will turn around and say, "Oh, well, we can't use your CNI plugin because it's not part of the API server."
Okay. So maybe tell you this, what if because right now we are discussing, we are just having we already know that set on interface name is a valid field, so that's something that CNI does support in the conflict, right? So you can pass that, so that's good. So I think the other thing is the primary field. Can that be supported by the conflicts? Probably could, right?
Oh yeah, because it depends on the IPM. You don't need it for DHCP because you can get the default route from
at that
the
point,
DHCP server. You don't need it for V6 at all. And you if you use host local or some of the other CNI IPMs, or you write your own, of course, that's always seems to be missing. You can always write your own. That will do the same, the essentially point the default route to a specific, to egress a certain interface. In fact, I'll argue I want primary or multiple for V4 because of ECMP. Because it's really not primary. It really, at the end of the day, becomes where you want your default route to point.
How, so what you're saying, having multiple, I don't want to go there.
Right,
Because
so
now,
certain things we're gonna go that, we'll go there, and others we won't. I'll argue we don't need this at all. So you want to compromise, if you could put primary, change primary to the default route, and let us put it on multiple network attachments, and then we're getting closer to agreement.
how I can, so how would you create multiple default? That will mean that you have just metrics, right?
No, ECMP, I want them to be exactly the same. I want to get to the API server over multiple interfaces because I live in a real redundant world. And if somebody decides to take a backhoe and remove my attachment to one Tor, everything survives over the other. And other than a slight latency spike, user won't even know about it.
Okay, I hear you now.
And I'm doing this today.
Any other comments from the team on this? I hear you, Michael. Yeah, and that's valid. Yeah, that's
We
fair.
can keep talking about it, but again, well, I'm just trying to, when you asked me to make sure we were on the same page, and
yeah,
this is where I am.
Sounds fair. So this one, the proposal is to strike it out. Where can I do that? I think. Okay. Let's. I have to think about it.
Drink on it. Drink
yeah.
heavily on it.
Yeah. So this is where I think the next thing that I wanted to get to finally is the thing that I added, because this is what Jaime was asking for. So, and that's why I'm leading towards that. That was the DRA piece. This guy, network interface. So what we could have is this guy. That's something that I was proposing in my initial draft from last year. But what this guy means is that this object would be a description not of the whole network, but of the single interface in a pod. All right, and let it sing, because this is important. It's it cannot be referenced multiple times. It can be referenced only once. It cannot be used in deployment sets or any replica sets unless it's the number is just one. The number of replicas equals one, because it cannot be replicated. It can be used multiple times, right? So that's what the guy would mean. So if I have like a Helm charts that define a single pod, it's perfectly fine. For each pod, I can create a separate network interface, but I cannot use this with deployments or daemon sets or something. What would this mean, right? This would mean that maybe this reference here would have another field here. And it's similar to what I think in resource claims we saw source, right? So this will be pod network name or pod network interface name. And you can reference one or the other only, right? You cannot reference both. You cannot. You have to have at least one of them, and they are not. And then they are optional, right? But there is a validation to make sure that at least one is referenced, right? So I can reference this guy or this one. So this is where there is very similar to what the DRA is doing. The big difference here is this single resource claim can be referenced multiple times. And I have Patrick here to correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's the case, right? Here, network interface cannot be referenced multiple times because we cannot have, let's say, if that field, one of the fields I'm proposing that it has is MAC address. We cannot have multiple interfaces having the same MAC address in the cluster, because though possible if they are in separate, let's say, physical L1 layers, it's still possible, but well, maybe. But at least kind of that will be kind of the issues you would have to deal with if you were to do that, right? What I'm proposing here is this will have only like 3 fields right now, and this doesn't fully solve what Jaime is asking for initially, but maybe this can be the gate to that, right? So bear with me. Initially, this would have things like which network I am from, because it has to be, and this guy is per network, so it's multiple of network interfaces pointing to a single network, right? So that's a given. Same like pod referencing, multiple pods reference same pod network. This is just the intermediary between the two, right? That can provide additional parameters to attaching this network to a specific pod, right? Right now it has just things like IP addresses. In a spec, you would define what sort of things you want to do, and then the status kind of has additional meaning here, because that's very important, because this object has could kind of serve as an additional meaning in the whole kind of multi-networking world. And what I mean by that is it could provide the information that we today we lack. Like for example, most of you probably is familiar with Multus. Multus, all the information about whatever has been set in the pod puts as an annotation in the pod annotation, right? You have the whole network status. I don't know the title of the key, but basically there is a network status, and it contains all the information about each interface that it added, right? So name, MAC address, IP, and maybe some other parameters if there are. But basically, by the way, this annotation is the kind of the main kind of inspiration that this object got created because of that annotation. I don't like annotation, so everything has to be properly structured from my point of view. So this is where this is the inspiration for that, right? So basically, this object can hold all the information wherever the implementation set inside the pod, right? It will boil down to that implementation to create this object or update it, because I don't think we can rely on Kubelet to do that. Maybe, but I'm not sure whether Kubelet could handle kind of all that. And there is a lot of question around the whole thing, right? So that's what kind of the gist of this object is. Tomo, you have a hand, please go ahead.
So now time is over. So and then maybe exactly. This network interface is a little bit complicated, and then maybe need more time to explain that.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's call it here. I agree with you, Tomo. Thanks for keeping the time. Let's continue on the discussion on this one next week, and please read through that. There is some description. There is not much to it, but familiarize with yourself with this, and let me explain it a bit more next week, and let's call it for today. Okay, thanks everyone. Hear from you next week.